Hello everyone, and welcome to the second departmental seminar at the University of Sheffield of the spring term. And it is our great pleasure to welcome Professor Stephen Darwall from Yale University. Professor Darwall is the author of a number of extremely influential books in ethics and moral philosophy and philosophy of action, including the second person standpoint, welfare and rational care, and today, and many others, which it would take a long time to list before we start the talk. And today, Professor Darwall will be speaking to us on the topic of transformative knowledge through love and respect, the cases of Frederick Douglass and James Baldwin.
Well, thanks very much, Max. It's a great pleasure to be here. Now, as I was saying to some of you earlier, this is the first time I've done Google Meet, and I'm going to try to do a PowerPoint. And you can't both present and see the faces on one screen in Google Meet, so I spent a little bit of time last night trying to watch YouTube videos and talk to my son and figure out how one might do that. So what I'm going to try to do now is I'm going to make my image go away first on this. Okay, then I'm gonna present. Let's see here, get this to work. Where did it go? 1 second here, sorry. Oh, I see what the problem is. Yeah. Share my screen. Get that to play. Okay, now I'm going to get this guy. Okay. Can everybody see the screen? See my screen?
That's right. Yeah.
And you can sort of see me, but you'll see that I'm not looking at you in the same way I was looking at you. I'm now being shot by the camera on my iPad, and so it'll be a little bit of an angle, but I know that'll be a little annoying, but at least I can see that they're human beings. Okay, so Max mentioned a couple of things that I've written in the past. One is called Welfare and Rational Care, and the other one, the second person standpoint. And in a way, both of those books are about the topic that I want to talk about with you folks today, which is love on the one hand, or caring, and the kind of value of persons or individuals, any being that can have a welfare, that it puts us in touch with a certain kind of mattering, a certain kind of intrinsic, as I've argued, agent neutral value, and the distinctive different kind of value of persons, at least, arguably many other kinds of beings as well, what Kant calls dignity, which I take to be an object of respect, where respect is a different attitude than love or sympathetic concern or caring, and responds to a different aspect of our value, to the value of individuals. And I want to tie this to the idea of transformative experience that my colleague Lori Paul has written about. And I call this transformative knowledge because I want to provide two examples of an experience that you can have that puts you in touch with a distinctive kind of value. One through the experience of respect, the other through the experience of love. And I say this is knowledge because not only are you having this experience, but it's in rapport with something that really does have that value, and you have the right relation to it, such that your way of regarding it is justified. And so I'm going to be discussing with you two pretty famous now, speeches in a way. One is a genuine speech by Frederick Douglass, the famous "What to the Slave is the 4th of July." delivered before the Civil War, of course. And the other is not really a speech, it's an intervention in a debate by James Baldwin. Now, I don't know if any of you have seen this film, I Am Not Your Negro, by Raoul Peck. Wonderful documentary. If you haven't seen it, I really recommend it. All of the clips that I'll be showing you today from this Cambridge Union debate of 1965 are in that. And actually, you can find on YouTube the entire debate, which I recommend as well. Okay. So let's just start with some philosophical points about the difference between love and respect. And love here we can understand pretty broadly to involve just caring, what I sometimes call sympathetic concern, which, as Liz Anderson first taught me years ago, doesn't have as its object a certain state of affairs, the welfare of another person. It fundamentally has that person as its object, or some other animal or some other being of some other kind. So love aims at the well-being of that being, and it also sees that being as having a certain distinctive kind of value that we really don't have a good word for. It's one of the things I think we mean when we say that someone matters, say that Black lives matter. I don't know a better word than precious, worth caring for. Judith Butler has this interesting notion of the grievability of certain lives. I think that's also in the same ballpark. The fundamental thought is that caring or sympathetic concern is a syndrome of different attitudes and dispositions to respond, different emotional sensibilities. It, of course, is partly constituted by the desire for someone's well-being, but that's really only a part of it. You can imagine that desire arising in ways such that it's disconnected from any disposition to grieve someone's demise, for example, or to be sad on their behalf that something bad has befallen them, or without a disposition to fear on their behalf that something bad might befall them. Caring is this combination, love is this combination, this cluster, if you like, of emotional vulnerabilities and sensibilities. Of course, love of a relational kind, where you are aiming for reciprocation from the other, whether in a friendship or in other more intimate, loving relations, is also aiming at reciprocation. So it's, in one fairly straightforward sense, second personal, in the sense that it relates to the other as a you and invites the other to relate back to one as a you as well. Respect comes in different flavors. Someone wrote a paper in 1977 arguing that there are two fundamentally different kinds of respect, called recognition respect on the one hand, and appraisal respect, where appraisal respect is something more like esteem for what someone has made of themselves or for their character or of some motivation they have, whereas respect as recognition is the disposition to treat someone in a certain way, to treat them as a source of claims. And you can respect in the recognition sense a whole variety of things. You can respect the law. You can respect your opponent's left hook. Let's say if you're a boxer, you can respect the mountain. You can respect the game. You can respect the ball. All of that is a matter of a disposition to treat that thing as making either certain prudential claims on you or more usually certain moral claims on you. Now, I argue in my work that respect for persons actually comes in two kinds. First view was that it's fundamentally second personal, and it involves placing yourself in a relation of mutual accountability with another person, making yourself accountable to that person, and being disposed to hold them accountable to you. But then I started to realize that there's another way that recognition can function in honor societies through a certain form of deference. So, excuse me, there's this phrase that can seem quite puzzling, that the law is no respecter of persons, or in the Bible it says God is no respecter of persons. And what could that mean? If God doesn't respect persons, then who does? And if the law doesn't respect persons, then who does? Well, what it means, of course, is that it doesn't respect differences in social status. And that's what honor respect constitutes. That's what it structures. So there's a kind of recognition respect for persons as their personae, which just means they're presented, socially presented persons, and we do that through, it's entirely a matter of performance. Whereas the kind of respect for persons that we typically have in mind is seeing them as a source of claims and demands on us, seeing them as a source of rights, and being disposed to treat them in that way. And I argue that that's always fundamentally second personal. That involves placing oneself in a relation of mutual accountability with that person. Okay. One of the things that's going to be involved in this talk is two different roles for empathy. So first, in second personal respect, when you're in a relationship of accountability with someone, then you are perforce in a position where you have to put yourself in their perspective. Even just to figure out whether they're understanding what you're saying, you have to imagine being them hearing what you're saying. So someone says something and you're not entirely sure what you mean, you put what they mean as a response to what you said, and you, excuse me, you put yourself in your perspective, in their perspective to see. Second personal respect is a matter of taking other people's perspectives seriously, so it requires empathy. Now you're going to see in this speech from Frederick Douglass how he's making use of that psychological mechanism just all over the place, and he's using it as an engine of respect. That's the point. You're going to see James Baldwin using empathy in a quite different way. Not as an engine of respect, though I think he's also doing that, but in a way, at least I'd say this is a matter of emphasis, more than the Douglass, Baldwin is wanting us to put ourselves into the shoes of Black Americans to feel what it's like to live in those shoes, not therefore to respect a claim that they have by virtue of their dignity, of course that as well, but to feel the emotional force of how unspeakably sad and, well, grievable that is. So in this case, he's using empathy not as an engine of respect, but as an engine of sympathetic concern, empathically informed sympathetic concern. It speaks to your heart in a way that the Douglass doesn't. That does as well, but it's more one's heart that's engaged. So I argue in my work that recognition respect for person is a kind of juridical second personal attitude. What makes it second personal is not just that it is implicitly addressed to a you, but that it comes with what I call an RSVP. It calls on the other to respect in response. So it's a respectful, it sees the other as having the standing to claim respect as well. So second personal respect is always mutual or implicitly reciprocal. It implies what I call second personal authority. That's the authority to hold one accountable, which thereby presupposes that one has the authority to hold the other accountable as well. And it's what I would now call a will-to-will relation, in the sense that, as Strawson said years and years ago, it implicitly makes a demand, so it's an expression of the will. And I mean, probably most plausibly, it's, respect itself is, but other attitudes that imply respect, like resentment, guilt, and the like, reactive attitudes, implicitly make a demand, thereby express a will, but they see the other as having a will as well. And so, of course, that's the crucial point in Strawson's Freedom and Resentment, that to have these reactive attitudes, it requires you to be in a perspective, what he calls the participant perspective, what I call the second person standpoint, from which you have to presuppose certain capacities of will of the other and of yourself as well. Okay, so that's respect. Love of the kind that invites reciprocation is also second personal. It's also a reciprocating attitude in the sense that it doesn't just have an object, but it calls for its object to respond in kind. But it responds not to the person's dignity so much as to their having a well-being. They're being beings for whom things can go well or badly. That it's something that it's like to live lives from that standpoint, and that the quality of the life for that person matters. And it matters not just because they have certain rights. It would matter even if they had no rights. It matters. Why? Because it justifies concern. It justifies caring, love, sympathetic concern. So rather than being a will-to-will relation, it's what I'd call a heart-to-heart relation. That is, it's an opening of one's heart to the other in the hopes that the others can receive that in their heart. So it's not just wanting to benefit them in the sense of giving them certain benefits. It's wanting them to be able to feel the benefit. And feel the benefit not just of the benefit itself, but to feel the benefit of being benefited benevolently, to feel the benevolence, to feel the love. So it's a love-to-love relation. It's a heart-to-heart relation. Okay. So before we get to Douglas and Baldwin, I just wanted very briefly go over a couple of passages just to warm you up a little bit. So these are both passages, they're pretty famous passages, one from Iris Murdoch, the other from Kant, that are, I think, illustrating a change of heart in the case of Iris Murdoch, in the case of Kant, a change of will. So in the Murdoch, this is this famous passage involving M and D. Let me just read this with you. I'm sure many of you know it already. M, who is the mother of a son who has married D. M finds D quite a good-hearted girl, but while not exactly common, yet certainly unpolished and lacking in dignity and refinement. D is inclined to be pert and familiar, insufficiently ceremonious, brusque, sometimes positively rude, always tiresomely juvenile. M does not like D's accent or the way D dresses. M feels that her son has married beneath him. Now, if you sort of drill down in all these terms, rude, juvenile, it all sort of gets summed up in the end when it says M feels her son has married beneath him. There's a kind of, maybe it's mild, maybe it's not so mild, disdain or contempt. This feeling as if from above for for D, below. And of course, there's the fear of loss of status, the sense that not only, when M's son marries beneath him, then that, of course, lowers M as well. So there's some sense of something like contempt. And contempt, I've argued, and I think is true, has not essentially another individual as its object. It has a certain kind of character as its object. It's what I'd call a characterizing emotion, in that it places someone in a certain role and sees them through the lens of that sort of narrative perspective from above. So it's a way of putting down, it's as seeing down, but not just putting down the individual, seeing them as being a low character. Hannah Arendt has this wonderful distinction between pity and compassion. And she argues, and I think this is right, that pity does the same thing. I don't want your pity. People don't say, I don't want your compassion. Compassion reaches out to the other. Pity looks down upon the other and characterizes them as pitiable. Okay. So long as M is in the grips of this kind of way of seeing D, which Murdoch calls, I think quite insightfully, a self-consoling fantasy, which of course, what's the consolation? The consolation is that, well, M is above. M is a better kind of person. Then that's the way she looks at D. Later, M has a kind of change of heart. And it's not entirely clear how this happens. It's very important to Murdoch that it happens through what she calls loving attention. That is, looking, seeing, attending to D as a particular individual, trying to disarm the characterizing emotions, the self-consoling fantasies that she has, the stories that she tells herself about D, and just looking at D. So anyway, Murdoch describes M as having a kind of self-reflective moment. I'm old-fashioned and conventional. I may be prejudiced and narrow-minded. I may be snobbish. I'm certainly jealous. Let me look again. Then M sees D as not vulgar, but refreshingly simple, not undignified, but spontaneous, not tiresomely juvenile, but delightfully youthful, and so on. The point here is that somehow, arguably through self-reflective work, through attention, through emotional labor, M is able to have this change of heart. And in having this change of heart, she's able to find in her heart love for D and to see her quite differently. Okay. The example from Respect comes from a passage in the Critique of Practical Reason. And just before this passage, which begins before a humble common man, Kant has this passage from Fontenelle that says, I bow before an eminent man, but my spirit does not bow. So the bowing before an eminent man, eminent meaning socially eminent, a person of higher status, is a version of what I'd call honor respect. It performs respect of a kind that, if people just do it generally, makes it the case that the person is eminent. Okay, and that's being contrasted in Fontenelle with something like appraisal respect. That is, my spirit doesn't bow. I don't feel any esteem for this person. Okay. Kant, by contrast, says this, quite remarkable. Before a humble common man in whom I perceive uprightness of character in a higher degree than I'm aware of in myself, my spirit bows, whether I am aware of it whether I want it or whether I do not, and hold my head ever so high that he may not overlook my superior position. So notice the contrast there. Kant, in this case, this is a person who's below, right? And Kant is not performing respect for him. Otherwise, he's performing contempt or disdain. He's, okay, you're low, okay? But he can't help but notice that this humble common man also is an upright character somehow. He sees him doing something that is only explainable by his conscientiousness. Okay. His spirit bows. He can't help himself. His example holds before me a law that strikes down my self-conceit when I compare it with my conduct, and I see observance of that law, and hence its practicability proved before me in fact. Now, I think the important point for our purposes is that there's a kind of moment here where Kant's normal defenses are disarmed. Okay, and I'm going to argue that that's what's happening in both the Baldwin and in the Douglas as well. Something disarms defensiveness. In this case, it's just that this is a humble common man who has no pretensions to being honored by others. He's not in any way miffed, let's say, when Kant holds his head high. So Kant doesn't have to, as it were, defend his social position. That defense is down. And when it's down, he finds in himself this source of respect for this person. This respect is what I call appraisal respect. It's a form of esteem for this person. But in esteeming, the crucial other point for Kant is that what he's esteeming this person for is not nobility of character, or that they are especially noteworthy in their moral accomplishment. They're just upright. They just do their job. And Kant he finds in himself this respect for doing your job, doing your moral job, uprightness, conscientiousness. And then by appreciating that, he sees that this common humble person has within him all that's necessary to be an object of moral esteem. He just does his job with the same equipment we all have that we have to have in order to be subject to the moral law at all. So he says, I see in this person observance of the law and hence its practicability. I see that he does it, I can do it too. Anybody can do it. Okay. And that accomplishes a kind of change of will. So we're to imagine this person now as being, if you like, encouraged in himself to be conscientious, to follow the moral law. Okay. Now to the main event here. So watch and listen for the pronouns. That's what's doing, I think, a lot of the rhetorical work, both in the Douglas and in the Baldwin, and I'm arguing it's doing different rhetorical work in these two speeches. So you can see there are many occurrences of you and your, and also fellow citizen and we. And sometimes the function of these is to set up an opposition between Douglas and the people he's addressing. And sometimes he's encouraging them to see themselves as a we that includes Douglas. But always I'll be arguing the function is to create a space of mutual accountability. and to make the people to whom he's addressing feel recognition, respect for the person who's addressing him, and also for enslaved peoples, on whose behalf he's speaking. Baldwin also uses you a lot, but I'll be suggesting, and I hope illustrating, that the function of the yous is to elicit empathy in a different way, not to feel the force of legitimate claim, but to make us feel what Baldwin calls the expense, the massive expense of the American dream for African Americans. Okay, so he's using empathy as a way of trying to elicit sympathetic concern and love. Okay, so let's start with the Baldwin. So this speech that was given to the Rochester Women's Anti-Slavery Sewing Society, or it might have been Sewing Anti-Slave. I can't remember exactly what the word order is, but it's kind of a remarkable group. And it was on July the 5th, 1852, so 13 years before the war begins. And Baldwin starts off, he says, this, for the purpose of this celebration, is the 4th of July. It's not, it's the 5th, but for the purposes of the celebration, it's the 5th, it's the 4th. It is the birthday of your national independence and of your political freedom. I mean, this is the first thing he says, right? You know, it's like right out of the blocks. I don't know why I'm here. This is all about you. Okay. It's the birthday of your national independence and of your political freedom. This, to you, is the Passover, is what the Passover was to the emancipated people of God. This celebration also marks the beginning of another year of your national life. It reminds you that the Republic of America is now 76 years old. I mean, what would it have been like to be in the audience and it's like, oh, wait a minute. All of a sudden, there's this something's happening here. Now, later in the speech, Douglas says that he can't claim himself to be regularly descended from your fathers. And he says also that this 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice. I must mourn. Not just, I don't rejoice, I must mourn. But at this point, earlier in the speech, right off the beginning, Douglas turns from this, you know, okay, you guys, this is your celebration. Here I am. This is your celebration, just to remind you that you can celebrate this. And he says, he returns, at this point, he has really a kind of hopeful thought. I am glad, and now notice what he says, fellow citizens, that your nation is so young. 76 years, though a good old age for a man, is but a mere speck in the life of a nation. There is, he says, hope in this thought. Now, what a sentence. I am glad, fellow citizens, that your nation is so young. You know, am I in this nation? Am I out of this nation? So the rhetorical move is, it's a little bit of jujitsu. It's, you know, on the first hand, he's calling them as fellow citizens, and then he's saying in the next breath that he's not really a fellow citizen, that it's your nation. Okay. But now to the hopeful thought. Again, the hopeful thought is, look, we're still a young nation. Okay. So he runs an argument that depends on an analogy between your fathers, between in particular the bondage that your fathers rose in rebellion to oppose in the 18th century against of course, the British, on the one hand, and on the other, the bondage today in 1852 of a seventh part of the inhabitants of your country. Citizens, your father made good that resolution. They succeeded, and today you reap the benefits. Probably I should have read the thing before that. The Declaration declares it self-evident that all men are created equal and are endowed with inalienable rights. Okay, so those are the benefits. The benefits are the benefits of freedom, liberty, and being free of the British yoke. Okay, and you today reap the benefits. But then Douglas makes 2 points. First, the benefits of equal liberty and justice haven't been extended to enslaved peoples, as the founders' documents plainly require. So there's work still to be done. Good thing the nation is young, because there's a lot of time to do the work. Okay, better start now. But secondly, you have no right to enjoy a child's share in the labor of your fathers unless your children are to be blessed by your labors. You have no right to wear out and waste the hard-earned fame of your fathers to cover your indolence. There's a debt to the fathers, to the founders, to complete their work. And that's a debt that's owed by everyone in the country. Douglas also goes on then to express what he calls a sad sense of the disparity between us. Again, I am not included in the pale of this glorious anniversary. The rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence bequeathed by your fathers is shared by you, not by me. So in addition to the debt to the fathers, there's a debt to those who haven't been included. Why, Douglas asks, was he invited to speak? The question that must have arisen in the very first sentence. Do you mean, citizens, to mock me? Here's a charge. He doesn't say, you mock me directly, but there's an implied charge. The question is raised. Did you mean to mock me? Is that why I'm up here? It's at this point that he turns to putting his audience into an empathic appreciation of the debt still to be paid, both to the fathers and also to the enslaved. Above your national tumultuous joy, I hear the mournful wail of millions, whose chains, heavy and grievous yesterday, are today rendered more intolerable by the jubilee shouts that reach them. So, it's not just that their situation is really awful, but you're celebrating a national life, part of the story of which is that their life is awful, and that this nation has made their life awful. Okay. If I pass lightly over their wrongs and chime in with the popular theme of celebration, that would make me a reproach before God. So he says he has to therefore identify with the American bondman and make his wrongs mine. Now, by introducing this thought just previously that there was a kind of morally problematic situation that the audience in the Women's Anti-Slavery Sewing Society put Douglas in by inviting him to speak to them on this occasion, that makes it even more vivid to his audience that Douglas has no other course than to speak on behalf of the enslaved, and that his audience has a special obligation to hear what he's saying. And so he goes into it. Behold the practical operation of the internal slave trade. The crack you heard was the sound of the slave whip. The scream you heard was from the woman you saw with the babe. So he's not just describing from an observer's third person perspective how terrible things are. He's putting you into the scene itself and saying to you that you've heard this yourself. So you yourself are a witness to the crime and therefore have a kind of complicity that you wouldn't have otherwise. Of course, all this was true even before he spoke, but it's brought into the present by the speech and brings his audience into, gives them a kind of experience that they otherwise wouldn't have had. So in the second person standpoint in other works, I've argued that when we hold someone accountable with moral blame, we presuppose their authority to hold us accountable in return. We assume a shared second personal authority and mutual accountability. And we assume also a shared second personal competence that we're capable of holding ourselves and one another accountable. At one point, Douglas asks, must I undertake to argue that the slave is a man? The slaveholders themselves acknowledge it when they punish disobedience on the part of the slave. And then he concludes, what is this but the acknowledgement that the slave is a moral, intellectual, and responsible being? So everybody already is committed to recognition, respect for the enslaved, because they're holding the enslaved accountable, criminally accountable through laws. So they're committed to regarding them as a source of claims, to use Rawls's phrase. Okay, so just to sum up that part of it, the claim is that through these rhetorical devices, Douglas is giving his audience an experience of recognition, respect, and of their own accountability to Douglas himself, to the enslaved. Okay. Now I want to go to what I'm arguing is a different rhetorical activity that gives rise to a different kind of experience. So this is a debate between James Baldwin and William Buckley before the Cambridge Union in 1965. And this takes me back. In 1965, I was in Yale as an undergraduate. And Buckley was kind of a bad boy hero. So the big people around Yale in those days were sort of the memory of Buckley as this sort of conservative intellectual, and William Sloane Coffin, who was a very progressive, radical clergyman, very important in the anti-draft movement and anti-war movement in the 60s. So Baldwin debates Buckley in the Cambridge Union. If you see I Am Not Your Negro, the Raoul Peck documentary, you'll see two other Yale figures, neither of whom would bring great credit on the institution. Yale looks really bad in relation to Baldwin in a number of different ways. So there's Dick Cavett, who interviews Baldwin at one point on his TV show. And he's a not terribly unsympathetic figure, but the other person who comes onto the show with Baldwin is a guy named Paul Weiss. And I'll bet dollars to donuts that very few of you even know the name Paul Weiss. But in the 1960s, he was a huge figure on the Yale campus as a philosophy professor. I won't say anything more. You have to see the film to see how kind of massively out of it Paul Weiss was. Okay, so the question is, the American dream has been at the expense of the American Negro. Of course, Buckley is arguing that's not the case, and Baldwin is arguing it is the case. So what I'm claiming is that Baldwin gives his audience a potentially transformative experience of love. That he speaks from the heart, doesn't have a text. He makes his audience feel the expense of being Black. He doesn't so much charge wrongdoing as calling for mutual acceptance, inclusion. And just to warm you up on that point, in Baldwin's letter to his nephew on the 100th anniversary of emancipation, Baldwin's quite clear about the role of love in his own thought. He says to his nephew, the really terrible thing, old buddy, is that you must accept them. I mean that very seriously. You must accept them with love. So here I'm drawing on Chris LeBron's chapter, Where is the Love, on Baldwin and Martin Luther King in his book, Making Black Lives, the Making of Black Lives Matter. So let me just, I'm going to play 4 clips. So let me just start with this first one here. Oh no,
Steve,
you can't hear it.
Yeah.
Okay.
That one, it says it's muted.
Can you hear it now?
Still no.
Okay, let me try the whole different thing here.
Okay, all right, great.
Okay, let's see what I'm going to do here. Put that down. Now, I'm not sure. This should work. Let's try this again. Okay. So can you see it now?
Yes, although it still says
now let me see. Try and play it now.
It still says it's muted.
Oh, I know what the problem is. I know it. Thank you. Got it. No. Okay, now let's try this. You can hear me now, right?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, now.
Still, no
Yes
volume.
or no?
Sorry. No volume, no.
Stone, and every face is white.
Here we go.
And
Does
since
that
you
work?
have seen the mirror, you suppose that you are too.
Okay, let me start that
It
again.
comes
Sorry.
as a great
Who knew that that would be it? Okay.
This means, in the case of an American Negro, born in that glittering republic, and in the moment you are born, since you don't know any better, every stick and stone and every face is white, and since you have not yet seen a mirror, you suppose that you are too. It comes as a great shock around the age of 5 or 6 or 7 to discover that the flag to which you have pledged allegiance, along with everybody else, has not pledged allegiance to you. It comes as a great shock to discover that Gary Cooper killing off the Indians when you were rooting for Gary Cooper, that the Indians were you. It comes as a great shock to discover that the country, which is your birthplace, and to which you owe your life and your identity, has not in its whole system of reality evolved any place for you. The disaffection, the demoralization, and the gap between one person and another, only on the basis of the color of their skins, begins there and accelerates throughout a whole lifetime. So that presently you realize you're 30 and are having a terrible time managing to trust your countrymen. By the time you are 30, you have been through a certain kind of mill. And the most serious effect of the mill you've been through is, again, not the catalog of disaster. The policemen, the taxi drivers, the waiters, the landlady, the landlord, the banks, the insurance companies, the millions of details, 24 hours of every day, which spell out to you that you are a worthless human being. It is not that. It's by that time you've begun to see it happening in your daughter or your son or your niece or your nephew. You are 30 by now, and nothing you have done has helped you to escape the trap. But what is worse than that is that nothing you have done, and as far as you can tell, nothing you can do, will save your son or your daughter from meeting the same disaster and not impossibly coming to the same end.
Okay. So just think about how empathy was working in that clip. So you feel, of course, the expense for, let's say, Baldwin himself describing his own experience. And it gets to be there's a point where, you know, what he's focusing on are certain indignities, like the landlady addressing you in a certain way or the cop addressing you in a certain way and so on. And you might think, well, but that's more like, you know, something like resentment, that he's claiming that he's been unjustly treated. And then it goes even deeper where he's, you know, he starts to talk, he says that's not really the problem, or the biggest problem. The problem is you get to be 30 and you realize that your son, your daughter, your niece, your nephew, they're condemned to the same life, will be as well. And there's nothing you can do about it. And so now that's less a claim of injustice on his own behalf. That's him showing you how heartsick he is, and consequently you become heartsick as well by realizing vividly the expense for yet younger people still to come. Okay, so from that passage, Baldwin goes on to this one, which strikes a quite different note.
I am stating very seriously, and this is not an overstatement, that I fixed the cotton, and I carried it to market, and I built the railroads under someone else's whip for nothing.
Okay, so there, clearly, expense is partly about a bill that's due. Something's owed to me. But I think you hear in his voice not just something like indignation, you also hear a certain kind of personal anger and hurt that I would say is not itself explicitly or essentially juridical. It's a sense of, how could you do this to a fellow human being? Okay, now, from that moment, which can seem like it's in the same sort of rhetorical mutual accountability space that the Douglas was, Baldwin turns to a very different note about the expense of the American dream, not just for African Americans, but for whites who enforce white supremacy.
Now, I suggest that of all the terrible things that can happen to a human being, that is one of the worst. I suggest that what has happened to white Southerners is in some ways, after all, much worse than what has happened to Negroes there. Because Sheriff Clark in Selma, Alabama, cannot be considered, no one can be dismissed as a total monster. I'm sure he loves his wife, his children. I'm sure that, he likes to get drunk. He's, after all, one's got to assume, and he is visibly a man like me. But he doesn't know what drives him to use the club, to menace with the gun, and to use the cattle prod. Something awful must have happened to a human being to be able to put a cattle prod against a woman's breast, for example. What happens to the woman is gaslit. What happens to the man who does it is in some ways much, much worse.
Okay, and then he sums up this theme in this sort of ending remark here.
It is a terrible thing for an entire people to surrender to the notion that 1/9 of its population is beneath them. And until that moment, until the moment comes when we, the American people, are able to accept the fact that I have to accept, for example, that my ancestors are both white and black, that on that continent we are trying to forge a new identity for which we need each other, and that I am not a ward of America. I am not an object of missionary charity. I am one of the people who built the country. Until this moment, there is scarcely any hope for the American dream, because the people who are denied participation in it, by their very presence, will wreck it. And if that happens, it's a very grave moment for the West. Thank you.
Tremendously moving moment now, the whole of the Union standing and applauding this magnificent speech of James Baldwin. Never seen this happen before in the Union in all the years that I have known it. Baldwin is smiling, obviously delighted by his reception, tremendously moved by it.
Okay, so that line, the people who are denied participation in it, the American dream, by their very presence will wreck it. I think the first few times I heard that line, I thought, well, what that meant was that, something like the fire next time, that you can push us so far, but then ultimately you'll have to pay because we'll have to stand up for ourselves. And so we'll wreck the American dream. I think I've come to believe that that's not what he meant. What he meant was that the very presence of a racially subjugated group undermines any American dream worth wanting for both groups, chiming in with the point he's making about Sheriff Clark and a person who could be have their self and selves and spirit so distorted that they could bring themselves to use a cattle prod against a woman's breast. So what I'm claiming then is that Douglas gives his audience a transformative experience of respect and knowledge of their equal dignity and mutual accountability, and Baldwin gives his audience a transformative experience of love and knowledge that Black lives matter, not just in the juridical sense of having equal rights, but in that of being fitting objects of love. And with that, I'll stop sharing, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. So now, if it's okay, we'll take a 5-minute break and reconvene at 3:43 for the Q&A. And Luca will be chairing that, and we'll explain the procedure when we come back.
Great.
And thanks again. That was fantastic. And I'll end the recording now.